It was surly autumn in the small town of Maplewood, a place that combined the tranquility of tree-lined streets with the presence of old mansions that harked back to distant times. Agent LaChill was approaching, bringing yellowed leaves that danced in the wind and blanketed the sidewalks, as people went about their routines in a relaxed pace, for rarely did anything happen there that could disturb the peace. However, that morning something strange and unsettling would put Maplewood at the center of our remarkable story, filled with mystery and emotion tension at all. Began with four dogs well known in the neighborhood: Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby. They were gentle, well cared for animals that roamed the streets, receiving affection from nearly all the residents. It was common to see them mow the lawn in front of City Hall or near Miss Burney's little market, where they would get some treats. But that morning something was different. Instead of wandering through their usual spots in search of food or pats, the dogs seemed united by a purpose, and none understood. They hurried past yards and alleys, sniffing the air, alert to an invisible call. Anyone looking into their eyes would notice a certain sense of urgency, as if they had been given a task. Only they recognized at the end of an avenue lined with ancient oaks stood an old cemetery. It was surrounded by a low gray stone wall covered by vines that turned red. In the fall, generally, that place remained silent, visited only occasionally by relatives who came to leave flowers for their loved ones. But on that day, the cemetery would be the point of convergence for a mystery that would change Maplewood's history. The dogs entered through the rusty gate. Without hesitation, Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby sniffed every corner, intensely focused. A few birds perched on marble crosses took flight when they noticed the unexpected arrival. The few people there doing maintenance work immediately took notice of the canine quartet. It was unusual to see them come up to the cemetery. A group crossing the main alley lined with cypress trees. The dogs stopped at a specific spot nearly hidden by weeds. It was a neglected patch of earth with a headstone so worn that the letters were barely distinguishable. The marble was cracked, covered with moss and scratches. Apparently it was a grave that hadn't received visitors in decades. Without barking or hesitation, the dogs began to dig into the damp soil. Their paws flung dirt away, quickly drawing the attention of anyone nearby. A local gardener, Walt, noticed the scene and approached, finding the dogs behave. Usually dogs avoid digging in cemeteries because the quiet atmosphere makes them uneasy. But Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby were so determined that they didn't notice Walt's presence. In a short time, signs of old wood emerged, evidence of a coffin buried closer to the surface than one would expect. Intrigued, Walt tried to shoo the dogs away, fearing they were disturbing recent burial. Thought that part of the cemetery was famously old. Realizing something serious was happening, the garden ran to the house of his supervisor, Miss Harrison, who was in charge of the cemetery's administration. In less than 15 minutes, a small group had formed around the hole dug by the dogs. Besides Walt and Harrison, a few onlookers who had been passing by decided to take a look. Curiosity and a certain discomfort began to grow as noon understood what had driven these dogs to digrite. There apparently that forgotten grave shouldn't have anything of interest, or at least that was the initial assumption Max, the strongest of the canine group, managed to pull up considerable amounts of dirt. At some point, the wood of the coffin became visible. The onlookers exchanged glances, unsure if they should proceed. The feeling that something sinister was about to be uncovered grew stronger when Buddy let out a low growl, less of fearing or warning about something. Then Rosie gave a sharp yelp, pulling her paws back as she scratched a piece of wood that appeared to be rotten in some areas but surprisingly solid in others. While Toby dug with determination, driven by what seemed like a desperate urge. By this time, Harrison had called the local sheriff, Ryan Mitchell, asking him to come to the cemetery and check what was presumably an old coffin. Merging city laws required notifying the authorities whenever there was a suspicion of vandalism, or in this case, any possibility of reopening graves without authorization. Sheriff Mitchell arrived, accompanied by his assistant detective Christine Blake and two rookie officers, Andrews and Palmer. Upon seeing the advanced state of the excavation, and especially noting the dog's dedication, they immediately cordoned off the area. Asking people to step back, they formed a circle around the grave. Curious onlookers gathered outside the gate, trying to see what was going on. The air felt colder than ever, giving everyone the sort of chill that didn't come only from the weather. Christine knelt down to take a closer look. She was an experienced detective used in cases of urban violence, but nothing in her training had prepared her for such a bizarre scene. Four dogs digging up a grave with unwavering intensity, as if obeying someone's orders. It was impossible to ignore the possibility that something very old and perhaps disturbing lay inside that coffin. Even so, proper procedure had to be followed. Sheriff Mitchell made some calls to City Hall, requesting access to death records and burial locations. Maplewood had old ledgers stored in the municipal library, had then requested the presence of Doc Patterson, the medical examiner responsible for determining causes of death in the area, to verify whether these were uncatalogued human remains or if, by any chance, there was any irregularity before the formal removal operation began. The dogs had already exposed much of the coffin's lid. Through the cracks in the wood, one could see something dark. The people there backed away, as nobody wanted to risk opening. It unprepared then Rosie nudging the lid with her snout forced a creaking sound that echoed in everyone's ears part of. It was looser ready to be pulled off at the same time. Toby started letting out a higher-pitched bark buddy, and Max positioned themselves side by side, as if trying to protect something. Sheriff Mitchell, noticing their unease, ordered everyone to keep their distance. He called Christine for a quick conversation. They decided they would only open the coffin in the presence of the medical examiners, since they needed to be sure they weren't violating any laws or disturbing potential evidence of an old crime. Dr. Patterson arrived about an hour later, carrying a small case of basic instruments. She was a middle-aged man, usually quite self-assured but visibly uneasy. This time he said that by the color and condition of the boards, this was indeed quite old, possibly from the previous century, or veneerly, or most graves in that area dated from the late 19th century, or early 20th. However, without municipal archives, it would be difficult to know exactly whose grave it was putting on. Gloves, the medical examiner asked one of the officers to help remove the lid carefully. With each effort, the wood groaned, releasing a stale smell, a mix of earth moisture and something unknown. Mood was filled with suspenses. Several onlookers outside covered their faces or peeked through their fingers, afraid of what they might see when they finally lifted the lid completely. What was revealed shocked everyone. There were not merely loose bones, as one would expect from an old coffin. Inside lay a strangely preserved body, wrapped in thin cloths that, though worn by time, still protected parts of the flesh, shining as small flashlight. Doc Patterson noticed the individual's skin gray, his hand somewhat dried out, yet not fully decomposed. There were even clumps of hair still attached to the skull, and the hands crossed over the chest were almost intact with thin dark nails. Had the courage to look for more than a couple of seconds, felt their stomachs turn. Nobody in Maplewood had ever seen anything like this, but Rosie, Max, and Toby curiously had stopped digging and barking. They were now sitting watching the body without any sign-off. They seemed relieved, as thought they had completed the mission of exposing this centuries-old secret. Sheriff Mitchell and Detective Christine exchanged incredulous looks. There were obviously no signs of recent murder, but the preservation of that body was anomalous. Doc Patterson conducted a quick analysis, confirming that it was a skeleton with partially mummified tissues, so that the region's humidity did not favor natural mummification, unlike deserts or dry caves. It was therefore inexplicable that the corpse had remained in that condition for so long, especially given Maplewood's climate. One theory was some kind of conventional embalming, but no one had any idea who might have done it or when. Meanwhile, the commotion grew at the cemetery's entrance. Residents whispered stories about local legends involving supposedly cursed individuals, nighttime, pact, and other dark tales. People spoke of how in the town's early days, some outsiders were buried without official records, and there were rumors of stranger rituals conducted in the woods. Few had believed such stories before, but the discovery sparked everyone's imagination. Sheriff Mitchell decided to move the body to the local morgue and asked Gardener Walt and Administrator Harrison to keep watch over the area to prevent looting or curious intruders. Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby were led out of the cemetery. Although reluctant to leave, they seemed to agree to withdraw now that the coffin was open. In the hours that followed, Maplewood was abuzz. Local social media were flooded with speculation. Some spoke of zombies or witchcraft. Others suggested it might be an exceptional medical case of body preservation, perhaps due to minerals in the soil. Mayor Charles Davis held an informal press conference at City Hall to prevent panic, assuring everyone that the law was handling the situation and that Dr. Patterson would conduct further tests. But the mayor's words did little people down. Instinct told them something big and unusual was happening, and that this corpse was merely the tip of the iceberg at the morgue. Dr. Patterson did his best to analyze the body. He collected tissues, amples to send to specialized laboratories, but he suspected from the start that he wouldn't find anything ordinary. During a more detailed examination, he noticed a mark on the man's chest, a symbol difficult to decipher. It appeared to be a deliberate incision, something that might have been made in life or shortly after death. It wasn't any usual alphabetic character, but rather a sort of design with winding lines and contours that resembled ancient runes. This detail reinforced the theories about strange practices or forgotten cults. Curiously, Inthetaria was even better preserved, as though it had been soaked in some specific substance. Night fell over Maplewood. The morgue was close to visitors, but word that there was a bizarre corpse inside spread to every corner. Above all, rumors circulated that it was the town's dogs who had discovered it. Guided by an unknown force, many people began to notice that Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby behaved differently. They seemed more watchful, alert to every sound, sniffing the air. Frequently, some residents reported having nightmares. They had the impression of seeing a tall, grayish-skinned man peering through their windows at night. Others heard footsteps in their yards, as if someone was prowling around. Fear was taking hold. Although Sheriff maintained that it was all collective imagination, he himself didn't sleep well on that first day after the discovery. Every creak of the roof's wooden beams made him shudder the next morning. The sheriff received a visit from Harriet Johnson, every old lady who lived in an ancient mansion filled with books and objects from past generations. Harriet said she had heard about the open coffin and told him that her family kept records from Maplewood's distant past when settlers first established themselves in the region. She spoke of a man-a-med named Benedict Holloway, who supposedly lived in the first half of the 19th century and was rumored to have practiced dark arts to prolong his life. Legend had it that Holloway had been condemned for some sort of witchcraft, but Noon knew exactly what had become of his body after death. Harriet carried with her a loud notebook full of handwritten notes and drawings by her ancestors, which in archaic language mentioned a symbol engraved on his chest as proof of a PCT that should never be broken. Sheriff Mitchell's Cacalby, nature hesitated to give full credence to such old tales, but upon comparing Harriet's notebook with Doc Patterson's description, he couldn't help but notice the frightening similarities. The elderly woman asked for nothing in return for her information, but left him a warning: if that man really is Benedict Holloway, the town may be in danger. Don't forget him. Proper restore the night, may bring unrest to many hearts. The sheriff swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down his spine. He thanked Harriet and asked her to return if she remembered anything else. That same day, he summoned Christine and Doc Patterson to discuss how to proceed. Meanwhile, at the Morgan incident caused great commotion. Kathy White, the cleaning staff member, reported that as she walked through the dark corridors in the early evening, she heard a scratching sound coming from the chamber where the body was stored. Terrified, she ran to alert the other employees. Checking it out, they found nothing amiss, but Kathy swore she had seen the door of the Maury freezers lightly jar as if someone had pushed it from inside. Dr. Patterson tried to reassure her, saying could be a seal defect on the freezer door, or just her imagination influenced by the sinister stories surrounding the corpse. Even so, the incident spread quickly, and more people began to feed rumors that the body was somehow waking up. Detective Christine decided to spend the night in the morgue with Patterson's authorization to deter intruders, and at the same time see if any real phenomenon was happening, or if the was just vandalism during the night. She heard faint noises like whispers, but on searching the corridors, she found everything in perfect order. Still, she had the distinct feeling of being watched by someone stepping out the back door for some air. She saw Toby, one of the dogs, on the other side of the street, staring at the morgue building. He was motionless, as if standing guard. Krista, normally brave, felt an unexpected chill without any logical explanation. Something in Maplewood was deeply wrong. 2 days later, news of the preserved body reached regional newspapers, generating even more curiosity. People from nearby towns started coming to Maplewood to ask about the mummified man. The dogs had discovered this irritated Mayor Charles Davis, who feared the town would become a destination for ab-tourism. Heamed with Sheriff Mitchell, demanding a swift solution. They needed to officially identify the corpse, arrange a proper reburial, and put end to the gossip. Thus began a search through the oldest records, including those from the old registry office, to confirm whether Benedict Holloway existed or if there was any other name that matched the probable date. Meanwhile, Harriet Johnson received a visit from Christine and Doc Patterson. The elderly woman allowed them to examine her family's notebook more closely. On one of its pages, they found a drawing of a male figure with a spiral symbol on his chest, along with notes about a ritual for confining us all. There were references to biblical passages used in conjunction with ancient formula, in an effort to seal what the writers called a malignant influence. Harriet, their voice said that her ancestors had compiled all that information because they feared the repercussions of Holloway's practices. It occurred to them that perhaps Maplewood's founders had carried out a secret burial, sealing this man so that he would never be disturbed again. The notebook went on to say that if the coffin were violated and the mark on the chest exposed, the darkness could rise again. Christine refused to believe and says, but in light of the recent strange incidents, she was no longer entirely sure. Doc Patterson, for his part, was even more rational to him. It was an intriguing historical coincidence. The mark could be the result of crude embalming methods or a religious symbol. They didn't understand, even so people needed a concrete explanation. And above all, they needed reassurance, because Maplewood was entering a growing state of tension. Many reported recurring nightmare, felt as if they were being watched through their windows, heard footsteps in their gardens without ever catching anyone. Their buddy Rosie, Max, and Toby appeared frequently in the most unexpected places, growling as thought they sensed something in the air. The following weekend, Sheriff Mitchell and Detective Christine decided to hold our burial ceremony. The idea was to return that body to the earth from which it had come, but with proper authorization and ableing from Reverend Jonathan Reed, the most respected religious leader in town. The mayor supported the plan, hoping that a calm, solemn funeral would finally put end to the matter. The townspeople were invited to attend a small service at the cemetery, where the body would be interred once again, this time with a formal record on the designated day. The atmosphere was tense. Many people gathered near the cemetery gate, including curious reporters. Reverend Reed arrived with an old Bible, saying he would offer prayers for the unknown souls. Speech Dr. Patterson brought the coffin and reinforced with the body inside. Even without knowing the true name, they decided, tallest tight in their accords as the 19th century. Unknown man. The ceremony began at sunset under our dish sky and icy winds that rattled the trees. The Reverend read passages about eternal rest and repentance. People remained silent, some crying out of pure emotion, others simply fearing how it would end. In the front row, Harriet Johnson made the sign of the cross, while Christine watched closely, ready to intervene if anything got out of hand. Sheriff Mitchell stood next to one of his officers, both of them tense. Buddy Rosie, Max, and Toby, a son might expect, appeared around the cemetery and sat a few yards from the coffin. Every now and then, they perked their ears and let out a faint whimper. The instant Reverend Reed sprinkled holy water over the coffin, thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind picked up violently, nearly snuffing out the torchest. That the area, an elderly woman screamed, claiming she saw the coffin lid move. Several people drew back, and some began to run, fearing the dead man was alive. Sheriff Mitchell tried to keep his composure, shouting that there was nothing to worry about, that it was only the coffin shifting on its stand. But chaos had already erupted. A few reporters snapped photos at that very moment, capturing expressions of pure terror. To make matters worse, Buddy and Max began barking frantically, pacing in circles around the coffin, while Rosie and Toby curled up and howled as if sensing something evil in the air. Reverend Reed raised his voice in prayer, urging everyone to remain calm. Even so, the disturbance made it impossible to continue with so many people screaming and running. Convinced there was a dark force present, the ritual came to an abrupt halt. Mayor Charles Davis found himself in a tight spot, trying to keep the crowd from panicking. Detective Christine requested additional police units to remove panicked onlookers. In the end, the ceremony was cut short, leaving the coffin barely covered by a thin layer of dirt. Many considered that incomplete burial dangerous. That night, Maplewood could not sleep. The tension was palpable. Parents locked their children's windows, and the more superstitious residents lit candles indoors, believing they offered protection. Reports of strange noises in backyards multiplied, along with sightings of slender figures crossing deserted streets and the feeling of a dark presence hovering over the town. Under pressure, Sheriff Mitchell spoke with Harriet Johnson, asking if there was some way to purify that rushed burial. The old woman recalled that her family's journal mentioned complex rituals combining Christian religious elements with ancient practices. However, she claimed she was no expert and that there could be risks if something went wrong. Detective Christine called on an academic friend from elsewhere, Professor Martin Davies, who studied anthropology and folklore. Arriving a few days later, he examined documents, spoke with Harriet, and visited the spot where the body lay half buried. He concluded that if the symbol on the chest really was linked to ancient belief, Bellan immortality, or witchcraft, perhaps a liberation ritual would be needed. It sounded absurd in modern logic, but Maplewood was in a phase where fear outweighed all skepticism. Thus, they proposed a more discreet ceremony, quiet with only a few participants. By then, the mayor was desperate to end the collective hysteria, and agreed. Sheriff Mitchell accepted the plan, though he didn't believe in stranger rituals, convinced the town needed some symbolic solution to calm everyone down. Detective Christine Darr, Patterson, Harriet Johnson, Reverend Reed, and Professor Davis formed a select group. They chose a moonless night, hoping it would be more discreet. Buddy, Rax, and Toby could not be kept away. They always appeared at crucial moments, following that invisible summons at 11 that night, without any publicity. They gathered in an almost empty cemetery. A cold wind is set among the headstones. They brought flashlights, candles, and coarse salt. Since Harriet and Professor Davies mentioned that in some traditions salt was used to purify spaces, They were opened the makeshift grave and removed the coffin, again seeing the body still intact. Even after so much disturbance was jarring, there was something unsettling about its dried-out features, as thought the men lay on the verge of waking at any moment. Reverend Reed began reciting prayers, while Harriet read excerpts from her ancestral notebook. Professor Davies spoke phrases in Latin and in a dialect unfamiliar to most of them. It was a melted part of beliefs, but the group was united in one goal: to seal once and for all whatever force might be disturbing the town during the ritual. Buddy and Max stood still by the grave. Rosie growled under her breath, and Toby fixed his gaze on the coffin. At one point, a gust of wind nearly knocked over the candles. Professor Davies, sweating nervously, asked the Reverend to sprinkle holy water on the symbol on the corpse's chest. The moment the water touched the grave, Skin Detective Christine distinctly saw the dead man's torso contract. As though he were drawing breath, she gasped, causing everyone to turn around. Noon Elsa saw the same thing, but the scare was enough to make the very old Harriet drop to her knees in fright. Sheriff Mitchell rushed to her side. Reverend Reed raised his voice, praying more fervently. The night felt endless. The cemetery's silence was interrupted only by the labored breathing of those present, by rustling leaves, and by the chants alternating among Harriet, Professor Davies, and the Reverend. Dr. Patterson struggled against his own fears, striving to maintain a rational stance, but the oppressive feeling was overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity of prayers and strange incantations, Professor Davies indicated the ceremony was over, asking everyone to step back so he could scatter salt around the coffin and over the body itself. The idea was to break any ties that, according to legend, still bound the corpse to this world. No one moved for a few seconds, gripped by a strange lethargy. Then Harriet to weep softly, saying she felt a powerful energy fading away. Reverend Reed closed his Bible, making the sign of the cross toward the corpse. Sheriff Mitchell's wedding wore an expression that blended skepticism with relief. Christine tried to stay steady, but she was trembling. Doc Patterson did a quick examination to confirm that nothing had changed in the body. He noticed no visible difference, but admitted he'd felt something inexplicable, despite differing beliefs. Everyone there seemed to agree that a great weight had been lifted from the air. Slowly, they placed the corpse back into the coffin, shut the lid, and lowered it once more into the grave. This time, with greater care, they shoveled earth on top while reciting final prayers. Professor Davies ended by sprinkling salt over the grave and making a sign in the air, while Reverend Reed blessed the spot. When they finished, the dogs approached. Toby sniffed the freshly packed soil, then let out one single mournful howl. Buddy, Max, and Rosie did the same, as if responding in unison. Then they backed away and disappeared into the darkness of the night. Silent, that moment brought immediate peace, though it was hard to explain or rationally prove what had happened in the days that followed. The entire town breathed more freely. Many people noticed that the nighttime noises ceased, nightmares decreased, and the strange sense of a lurking presence was gone, though a few outsiders and reporters remained curious. Maplewood's routine began to return to normal. Sheriff Mitchell and Detective Christine filed official reports stating only that the unknown body was reinterred, and the investigation found no evidence of a recent crime. Mayor Charles Davis relieved avoid speaking much about rituals or magic, preferring to tell the press it had been a belated burial with due honors. Harriet Johnson put her journals away under lock, and Professor Davies returned to his home state, taking with him notes on that astounding experience. His only conclusion was that some forces lie beyond our understanding, and Maplewood is living proof. It did not take long for the story to become local folklore. In bar conversations or family dinners, people recounted the tale of the old mummified corpse, discovered thanks to the town dog's romanticized versions, claimed the man was a powerful sorcerer, run dumb by his own dark arts. Others said he was innocent, a victim of collective hysteria, and some insisted it was merely an exceptional, scientific case of bodily preservation. However, the main facts were undeniable. Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby had dug up the forgotten grave. The body they found was in an improbable state. Strange nightmares and phenomena afflicted the town, and only after an unusual ritual did everything return to normal. This narrative was so incredible that little by little it would become legend, passed down through generations by the town's elders. As for the dogs, they resumed their habitual rounds through the streets, wandering by City Hall's garden, napping near the grocery store, getting treats from the locals. They became Neros, for everyone knew that without them that secret might have lain untouched for centuries, preserving an invisible unsettling aura. It wasn't uncommon to see visitors approach Buddy or Rosie to pet them, thanking them for somehow freeing Maplewood from an unknown evil. Time went by and life took its course. Many old houses were renovated, the cemetery was improved, and the forgotten grave received a small iron cross with the inscription "Rest in Peace." Reverend Reed offered regular prayers at that site, and whenever possible, Harriet Johnson left white flowers, their murmuring hopes that the town would never again face such terror. Detective Christine went on to handle more complex cases in Maplewood, but she never forgot the moment she thought she'd seen the corpse move. Sheriff Mitchell maintained his professional skeptical stance. Yet on sleepless nights, she recalled Harriet's frightened eyes and the dog's eerie howls. Doc Patterson, in turn, published a modest medical article on the mummified body, without delving into the supernatural aspect, lest they lose academic credibility, and so Maplewood found a new balance. However, if anyone wandered near the cemetery late at night and listened closely, they might occasionally hear a faint sound like a sigh rising from below ground. It could be just the wind against the stone, of course, but some believed it might be something else, a reminder that certain ancient secrets can rest, but never fully die. John Full Moon Knight's buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby, were often seen there sniffing calmly, as if checking that everything remained in order. After that, they returned to the peaceful streets where they were just four beloved dogs in an apparently quiet American town. For many, that story would be told as one of courage, faith, and unity, an example of how a community can overcome its greatest fears by coming together. For others, it served as a reminder that there are phenomena beyond human reason, and that perhaps the unknown must be respected. Maplewood moved on, but with a truth that became part of its identity. Something ancient and filled with shadows had been awakened by the dogs, causing shock and dread. And thanks to a stranger ritual and the prayers of those who cared, the danger was apparently contained, although the whole truth was never fully explained. Every Maplewood resident knew that one should never underestimate a forgotten coffin renor. The call-off for dogs who, without a single word, led the entire town to face its deepest nightmare 7 years later. People still whispered about that frightening period. The old armchair in the library, where Harriet Johnson used to sit reading her books, seemed to carry echoes of stories found nowhere else but in her family's yellowed notebooks, and children in their innocent games made up sing about Buddy, Rosie, Max, and Toby, the magic dogs who discovered Maplewood's greatest secret, though much of what happened turned into legend and fodder for go. Those who witnessed those nights of vigil kept the memory vivid, brimming with details, still capable of sending shivers down one's spine. To this day, your world may be vast and full of explanations, but there are always cracks through which the supernatural seems to seep, reminding us that we're not masters of all truth. The dogs carried on as if nothing so extraordinary had occurred, yet each time Max or Toby paused to watch the crimson twilight, there was a certain wisdom in their dark eyes, as though remembering a completed mission, one whose urgency on Lithy had understood to dig up a forgotten grave and reveal to the world a corpse whose secrets defied both logic and faith.